Good evening. It's Kirk again, and we're going to talk a little bit about Shakespeare and the Elizabethan era. And just to give you a little bit of background on Shakespeare and the era in which he did his work. Uh, Before Queen Elizabeth, for whom the Elizabethan era is named, Queen Elizabeth the First. Uh, we had in England more than one family, and they were rivals. Mary, Queen of Scots, was Catholic, and while she was before Queen Elizabeth came to the throne, England was Catholic. Uh, so then, when Elizabeth came into power, she took England back to Protestantism, and that's known as the end of the House of Tudor. Now, you guys don't need to know all of those details, but it's nice to have a little bit of context when we're talking about these things. So, yeah, you've heard of Bloody Mary, Mary Queen of Scots, and Queen Elizabeth. Those are the queens that we're talking about, and this is the time. So this would be the beginning of the Elizabethan era. She was also known as the Virgin Queen, and during this time, William Shakespeare was born. You should probably know his birth date and death date. So Shakespeare was born in 1564. And here we've got the Bard, as he is affectionately known. It's supposed, or it's believed, that he wrote Romeo and Juliet between 1591 and 1594. So here's an illustration of the Globe Theater, where Shakespeare and his acting troupe performed their plays. And in total, it's said that Shakespeare wrote 38 plays, 154 sonnets, and 2 epic poems. He died in 1616, and he is buried at the church at Stratford upon Avon, which is where he's from, where he was born. You can't see it there, but it's Stratford upon Avon. That's where Shakespeare was from. Some curious information about the Globe Theater and the kinds of entertainment that you might find at that time. Besides attending plays, attending the theater, they used these theaters for other such things. And one of those was bear baiting, which is basically putting a bear, chaining up a bear and putting it there in the theater, and putting it against a dog, and making the dog and the bear fight to the death. And for sure there was gambling that occurred there. And then cockfighting would be, this is something that still occurs here in Mexico, when those are the rooster fights. So those things occurred there. And there's also evidence that that they had some probably pretty wild parties, and something of a sexual nature, probably occurred there as well. Uh, uh, During the Elizabethan era, music was popular, and much of this music was improvised, and you might associate it with folk music, which would be when people tend to use whatever instrument they have at hand, and they get together and improvise a song. And here are a couple of the instruments that they use. You can look them up if you're curious about what those instruments really are. You don't need to know that, but again, I'm just trying to give you a little bit of context that there was acting, there was dance, there was music. Uh, these are the kinds of there was literature during the Elizabethan era, so it wasn't just plays. Uh, and they had distinct social classes. Poor people were generally unemployed or homeless, and the middle class, they tended to be landowners. The people were had a very active social life, and they even played cards. The Elizabethan era is also famous for its fashion, and but before we get to that, I've got a little note here about masquerades that and here masquerade is a French word. Apparently they called their parties masks, and it's what we know as a masquerade party, where people would disguise themselves and wear masks, and then at the end of the party, they would reveal their identity and take off their masks. So that's something else that they were involved in. Sorry about the cut off picture. But I'm going to go ahead and go ahead with this instead of trying to pause it. Here's an example of some Elizabethan fashion. And I found something that I thought people would enjoy, which is a reference to the type of underwear that they wore. And here we've got an illustration of farthingales and corsets. So, of course, you probably know what a corset is. This thing that a woman would tie up around her waist to make it very thin. And as for the farthingale, I'm assuming that it's this thing around the neck, but honestly, I didn't look that up. I'm kind of guessing on that one because we've got a lot of things going on here, and we've got a hoop skirt, and we've got this ruffled collar, and then something back here. I'm not even sure if that's part of the outfit. I assume that it is something that looks like wings, but the corset is the one that we know. And yeah, I apologize for not looking up farthingales, but that's the other thing that was mentioned here. And then for the men, we've got breeches and a codpiece, which is something that you will hear mention of now and again, especially when you see historical pieces. It comes up. It comes up in literature, and basically it's a false thingy that the men wore to apparently to add some mass to their nether regions, which is curious and I think worth noting. We don't want to omit these things, right? So I thought that students would appreciate that. That's the cod piece. And here we've got our Queen Elizabeth again, and she ruled from 1558 to 1603, and that would mark the Elizabethan era. She was Elizabeth the First. King James was also king while Shakespeare was still alive. So Shakespeare was alive during the reign of a king and a queen. And let me see if I can fix this here. I might have to pause this after all. Okay, so I got my image back in the screenshot. Here's a little timeline of some of the major events that occurred during the Elizabethan era, and again, you guys don't need to know this for the exam. This is just to give you a little bit of context. I would say, besides when she took the throne in 1558 and when she died in 1603, the most notable thing for me is the Battle of 1588, which was an incredible sea battle between the English and the Spanish, right there in the English Channel. And we've got the death of Leicester, for whom Leicester Square is named after. So I've got a couple more images. Let's see. Yes, no, I remember. Let me see what else I got there. That's all I really wanted to say about Shakespeare, except for that if you're curious and you'd like to follow some alternative theories, then you might consider searching for whether Sir Francis Bacon or Sir Henry Neville might have been the true author, one or the other. One of them might have been the true author of Shakespeare's works. If I had to put money on it, I would bet that Sir Henry Neville was the true author of Shakespeare's works. And I mentioned this in class that I have some personal knowledge of somebody who's involved in this research, and I was personally convinced that this English gentleman, Sir Henry Neville, is probably the true author of Shakespeare's works. There's actually a lot of evidence that suggests it, including a document called the Northumberland document. And if you do a little research on that, you'll find that the Northumberland document is the only document from the period where Shakespeare and Francis Bacon are both mentioned, and it turns out that this document belonged to Sir Henry Neville, and there's a lot of evidence for that. And one specific piece of evidence pointing to the fact that Henry Neville was the owner of the document is the watermarks on the document. If you're curious about that, you can do a little search for the Northumberland document, and a lot of people believe that this is evidence that Francis Bacon was the true author of Shakespeare's works, but I suggest that you do a little bit more research, and if you really want to become informed on this super interesting theory that I believe is not a conspiracy theory, I believe there's some real validity here, go to YouTube and do a search for this YouTube video, and it's about an hour-long explanation where this Shakespearean or Shakespeare scholar lays out an extremely convincing argument pointing towards Sir Henry Neville as the true author of Shakespeare's works. So, not to take anything away from Shakespeare, but I also feel that it would be an error to omit such interesting and curious evidence. I wouldn't want anyone to tell me 10 years from now, oh, teacher, remember when you taught us that Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet? And then have that person say to me, well, now it's been proven that Shakespeare didn't write them. And on the contrary, if we see each other in 10 years and it has by that time been accepted that Sir Henry Neville was the author of Shakespeare's works, which is going to be somewhat doubtful because people aren't going to want to give up on that idea that Shakespeare is their man. If it should happen to happen that way, then we can laugh and smile, and you can congratulate me for having revealed that to you before other people did. So the idea of this video was to just give you some context about the Elizabethan era and when Shakespeare was born and when he died, and the time that the Elizabethan era encompasses, and some of the things that happened during that time. And you will not be expected to know a lot of the curious details. For example, the fashion and the musical instruments. We're not going to be asking you those kinds of things on the exam. So good luck, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Good night.